March has not been a boring month for aviation, which can be seen as both good and bad. Geopolitics, positive and negative news for Boeing, close calls and a strange fire certainly kept us in the team busy. So here is a quick look at some of the events in March that you may have seen, others that you might have missed, and a few that will probably continue to affect us in a long time to come. Stay tuned. Let's start with the latest on a story that has been really embarrassing and expensive for Boeing. Two astronauts, Sunita Suni Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore, who had been stuck on the International Space Station, have now finally returned back to Earth. Now, I know that they weren't really stuck there. The SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule that returned them had actually been on the ISS since last September, but they had been forced to wait for the next crew in order to keep the station staffing at sustainable levels, which, of course, didn't make this story any less embarrassing for Boeing. The two astronauts originally launched from Cape Canaveral on the 5th of June last year on board Boeing's CST-100 Starliner, but during their 25-hour journey up to the station, they then experienced several helium leaks and malfunctioning thrusters. Now, they did eventually dock on the ISS safely, but the Starliner's problems didn't impress NASA's engineers, who eventually decided to return the capsule empty back to Earth. Now, the two astronauts were only meant to stay up there for 8 days, which instead, due to this, turned into 9 months. Now, it is worth saying that Williams and Wilmore didn't just sit idle at the station during this time. They are both seasoned NASA astronauts who have been at the ISS multiple times before, so they ended up doing research, maintenance and other work at the station, and even conducted a spacewalk last January. And that, by the way, was the 9th spacewalk for Sunita Williams, which gave her a record for the woman with the most cumulative time spent on spacewalks, 62 hours and 6 minutes. Now, as for Boeing, this failure has already led to changes in the company. That includes the departure of Ted Colbert, who was the head of Boeing's Defense, Space and Security Division last September, and that was actually the first real management shakeup conducted by Kelly Ortberg, Boeing's new CEO. Overall, the Starliner program has so far cost Boeing $1.6 billion in cost overruns since 2016. But the silver lining, well, depending on how you see it, I guess, is that it's not dead yet. NASA still wants to have a second way to get their astronauts to space besides SpaceX Crew Dragon. But the catch is that NASA will likely now require Boeing to fly the Starliner without a crew one last time, and until the last mission, the plan had been for the next mission to have 4 astronauts on board. But it wouldn't surprise me if NASA preferred their vehicle to have at least one 100% successful test flight before they decide to use it with any more people on board. The second story we are going to look at was a close call that actually happened already back in February this year. Now, the reason that we're looking at it now is because the NTSB has released their preliminary report, which explains and clarifies some of the key points around what caused it. This event involved Southwest Airlines Flight 2504, which was flown by a Boeing 737-800, and a Bombardier Challenger 350 business jet operating as FlexJet Flight 560. Now, as this incident began, the Southwest 737 was approaching Chicago Midway Airport to land, while the FlexJet was taxiing out towards the runway that they were going to use for departure. According to the newly released report, the FlexJet crew initially got some confusing taxi instructions from air traffic control, which they then quickly clarified. And after that, they started making their way out from the ramp towards runway 22 left. Now, their clearance told them to use taxiway Foxtrot and then make a left turn onto runway 04 left 22 right, which is the parallel runway to the one that they wanted to take off from. But on the way out, they would need to cross 2 more runways, including 31 Center, which was being used for landings at the time. So the FlexJet crew were told to turn onto runway 04 left, cross runway 31 left, and then hold short of runway 31 Center, which they eventually did acknowledge. They didn't end up holding short. Instead, the aircraft continued taxiing onto runway 31 center right in front of that landing Boeing. A controller saw what the Flexjet crew did and tried to stop them, but he was unfortunately stepped on by another transmission, and while all of this was happening, the Southwest 737 was already over the threshold of runway 31 center and about to touch down. Now, as the pilots in that aircraft was descending through roughly 100 feet, they had already spotted that smaller jet in the distance and realized that it wasn't stopping. So the first officer called for a go-around, which the captain, who was pilot flying, executed immediately. But obviously, the aircraft still continued to descend for a short moment before its two engines had spooled up enough to start lifting them safely away from the runway again, and the Flexjet aircraft meanwhile just crossed the runway in front before stopping on the other side. The NTSB's preliminary report showed that at their closest point, the Flexjet and the Southwest aircraft were only 200 feet apart horizontally, at which point the Southwest 737 was 175 feet above the runway and climbing. So, how did this happen? Well, in the interview with the NTSB, the two Flexjet pilots explained that they intended to stop before runway 31 center as instructed, but they misidentified the other runway, runway 31 left, which came before as just a normal taxiway. Runway 31 left is actually quite narrow and very close to taxiway Foxtrot, which runs parallel to it. So when the Flexjet crew first turned from taxiway Foxtrot onto runway 04 left, they were already on top of runway 31 left before their nose wheel had straightened out after the turn. Now, there were hold short markings from runway 31 left, which should have shown them that they were about to cross a runway, but according to the Flexjet crew, a combination of the glare from the sun, which was coming from that direction, and the narrow width of the runway and the fact that they weren't expecting it meant that they just simply missed that. So that meant that when they came up to the next runway, the active runway 31 center, they thought that that was runway 31 left, which they had been cleared to cross. And again, the sun glare to the right meant that they didn't see the approaching aircraft on final either. Now, the NTSB investigation on this story is still ongoing, and we should see a final report on it in a few months from now, but what I really want to highlight here is that unlike what was implied by some sources after this event, the pilots in the business jet did not disregard air traffic control instructions, at least not intentionally. These pilots were trying to do as they had been told, but misunderstood where they were on an airport that they weren't very familiar with. And as I've said many times before, we want pilots to feel safe to come forward when they have made honest mistakes like this. That's why we only punish people for deliberate actions, not for mistakes. Which is why rushing to judge the actions and intentions of pilots or controllers doesn't help anyone. But do you know what does help? Having an awesome, almost immortal aerospace-inspired shaver, which is why I am so happy to have Henson as today's sponsor. Henson actually started as an aerospace machine shop, so they really know a thing or two about precision. When they designed the AL13 Racer, they built it with the same level of accuracy used for aircraft parts, and you can really both see and feel that. It just oozes of quality. Now, unlike most racers who let the blade flex and vibrate, the Henson AL13 holds it perfectly in place, which means an extremely smooth shave with no irritation. Just like a smooth morning departure without a hint of turbulence. Now, you could keep buying those cheap drugstore racers, but they are packed with plastic and waste, and the refills are overpriced, and they just don't last. Meanwhile, the Henson AL13 is machined from aircraft-grade aluminium, meaning it's built to last, no plastic, no waste. And when you compare its cost of ownership over 2 years with those disposable racers, you will also save loads of money. Just look at this graph. So if you are ready to get the last racer you will ever need, go to hensonshaving.com/now or use this QR code, and also use the code NOW for 100 free blades when you buy the racer. Just make sure that you add both the racer and the blades to your cart for the code to take effect. That's hensonshaving.com/now. Thank you, Henson. Now, let's get back to the news. The next memorable story that we saw in March happened on Friday the 21st, and it was a reminder of how easily a local problem can grow into becoming a full-blown international crisis. What I'm talking about is, of course, the fire in Hayes in West London, which ended up completely paralyzing Heathrow Airport, one of the biggest aviation hubs in the world. Now, the details of the fire in the Hayes substation are still under investigation at this point, but basically a transformer caught fire along with 25,000 liters or 6,600 gallons of oil meant to keep the transformer cool. Now, as a former firefighter myself, I don't envy the 70 firefighters who had to rush to that scene in the middle of the night to try to deal with that. That must have been pure horror. Initially, there were some suspicions that this could have been a criminal matter, but that was later proven not to be the case. And anyway, this substation served Heathrow, and for reasons that are still really not clear, as we record this at least, the fire also affected the secondary electrical supply to the airport, which meant that Heathrow couldn't operate without this substation in operation, and therefore had to close. Now, Ben and I made a special live video to discuss this on the day that it happened, and we looked at it from a pilot's perspective. Basically, like, how would we act if something like this happened to us while we were flying? And as we explained there, Heathrow did actually have emergency power during this event. So the control tower, approach and runway lighting as well as approach aids did continue to work. But this power likely wasn't enough for all terminals and other facilities to keep running and processing passengers and their baggage. So while the situation probably wasn't as catastrophic as what some reports suggested, the airport still had to close, which was a huge problem. The disruption happened relatively late, from around 11 p.m. local time, but it then lasted throughout the night and for most of the following day, causing over 1,330 flights to be cancelled, amounting to a passenger capacity of over 290,000 people. In the end, the airport reopened slowly a bit earlier than initially planned, about 18 hours after it had shut down, but at that time a lot of flights had already been diverted to either elsewhere in the UK and Europe or back to their departure airports even further away. This in turn meant that aircraft and crews were now in the wrong place, which led to it taking several days for everything to return back to normal again. Heathrow reportedly allowed flights to operate overnight once operations started past the normal curfew, prioritizing repositioning aircraft as well as some repatriation flights throughout the night. Now, it's still hard to estimate the total cost of this shutdown. Some analysts say it could be as much as $26 million only for the day of the shutdown itself, but more importantly, the public and many airlines are asking why and how a fire could have had such a dramatic effect in the first place. And somewhat embarrassingly, less than a year ago, Heathrow's authorities told the country's aviation authority that the airport was a leader in airfield resilience. Yeah. Unfortunately, it often takes costly events like this to reveal a single-point failure in a system. And in an unrelated incident back in February, a fire in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania in the United States severely damaged a factory belonging to a company called SPS Technologies. As Aviation Week reported, this company produces aerospace fasteners, nuts, bolts and other related components for commercial and military aircraft and engines, which turned out to be quite a big problem. You see, often manufacturers source even relatively simple parts like these from only one supplier to simplify procurement and to reduce certification costs. So in this case, this single fire caused the disappearance of the only certified supply of these particular parts for quite a few engine manufacturers. So cost saving by limiting suppliers works great until it doesn't, similar to a single point supply of electricity for a huge airport. Next up, we have a couple of stories about Boeing, which are actually much more positive than the one we started with. The first one has to do with the Boeing 787, where finally, after studying and working on them for 4.5 years, Boeing has finished the joint verification work it had to do on 122 of their 787s. This work had to do with the joints of the composite fuselage in the aircraft, which came under scrutiny back in 2020 when it was revealed that imperfections between the composite barrel sections of the fuselage were not meeting the required specifications. Boeing was supposed to deal with inevitable gaps and imperfections by using structural shims between these parts, but as the Air Current describes in their excellent reporting, the smoothness between the parts and the thickness of the shims used were not really always up to standard. It took a long time for Boeing and the FAA to study the problem and agree on the best way to solve it, and the problem was that in order to inspect each joint in every one of these aircraft, the jets had to be disassembled to such an extent that the time it took to inspect and fix them was actually longer than what it had taken to build them in the first place. Now, to do this, Boeing was using space in the Everett factory that was previously used to build 747s and 787s. Now, all 787s are built in Boeing's South Charleston, North Carolina facility, and the completion of this work means that Boeing finally can close that repair facility and move its workers on to other projects. Eventually, part of that Everett site will be used to set up an extra production line for its 737 MAXes. But for that to happen, Boeing will first need to get permission from the FAA to build more than 38 of those per month, and I'll get back to that later. The other Boeing good news story involves a military project, previously known only as the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or NGAD. This is basically a new stealth 6th generation fighter jet which has been developed to replace the F-22. The news in March was that the winner who was going to get to work on this program is Boeing, beating Lockheed Martin, who was the one who made the F-22. Boeing's future fighter will be called the F-47, which is a little bit of an interesting name because I thought that the US Air Force weren't reusing these F designations, but the F-47 was the post-war name of the World War II fighter called the P-47. Now, I could be wrong about that. Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Now, a key point in this story is that Boeing has previously lost a lot of money in various defense programs where they have agreed to fixed price contracts in which any cost overruns had to be covered by Boeing themselves. These money-losing contracts included a tanker version of the 767 called the KC-46, the MQ-25 Navy drone, the Air Force T-7 trainer, and the two 747-8s that were being converted into VC-25 Bravos, better known as the next Air Force One. Oh, yeah, and of course the Starliner capsule as well, which was also a fixed-price contract. Now, unlike those deals, which have cost Boeing an estimated $18 billion in cost overruns, Liam News reports that this contract for Boeing's F-47 is done on a cost-plus incentive fee basis, which should hopefully work out better for them. The value of this contract is over $20 billion, which is a big win for Boeing, who should keep benefiting from it for many years to come. Now, by the time that you watch this, we will probably also know if Boeing has won another similar contract. That's for the US Navy's next generation fighter program called the FA-XX, whose winner will be either Boeing or Northrop Grumman. Lockheed has apparently already been eliminated from that competition according to some earlier reports. Now, Boeing aren't the only aircraft manufacturer who have been benefiting from military contracts lately. Airbus are now reporting a surge of interest for defense and space programs from a number of countries in Europe and elsewhere. And this appears to have to do with the rapidly evolving geopolitics situation. As an example, Airbus Defence and Space CEO Michael Schulhorn said that there is an interest in a space asset that could act as an alternative to Starlink, while some countries are also interested in available cargo aircraft like the A400M and the C295. And while we're on the subject of geopolitics, in commercial aviation, both the airlines and the aircraft manufacturers are now trying to assess how the upcoming tariffs will affect the cost of aircraft as well as the cost of maintenance and many other things. Previously, rising passenger demand had made the industry quite optimistic, but recent events have caused some airlines, including Delta, American and United, to cut their profit forecast, which is not good news for the industry. The reason for this pessimism is partially caused by a drop in demand for travel to the United States from several different countries. As an example, demand for flights between the US and Canada has recently dropped by 70%. And I think it's fair to say that this unrest could stay with us for the coming weeks and months, and maybe even years if we're unlucky. In better news, Chris Rochelot, the acting head of the FAA, announced the hiring of 2,000 new air traffic controllers this year. This was important, given recent worries about the ways that various cost-cutting moves could affect the agency, and Rochelot also announced that the FAA will continue maintaining a strict oversight on Boeing, and that's something that's worth keeping an eye on. You see, as I mentioned earlier, Boeing aims to reach a monthly production of 38 737 MAXes, if everything goes to plan by the end of this year. And if they achieve that, they will likely want the FAA to lift the current production cap that stops them from making even more. And it will be interesting to see how the FAA will respond to that. Finally, we have a slightly less positive story for Boeing, and this involves their previous plea agreement with the US Justice Department regarding the 2 MAX crashes back in 2018 and 19. As I have explained in previous videos, this had to do with the fact that Boeing made several commitments to change their practices following those crashes. Then, when the door plug blowout happened early in 2024, it led to the Justice Department concluding that Boeing wasn't abiding by the agreed commitments, which reopened the investigation into Boeing's role in those 2 previous crashes. On top of that, the Justice Department also hit Boeing with a criminal fraud conspiracy charge, and more charges could follow later about the door plug blowout itself. But in July last year, Boeing then reached a plea agreement, effectively accepting their guilt for the 2 MAX crashes. Now that had some interesting implications for the company, including the fact that as a convicted felon, they technically couldn't get any new military contracts. Now, waivers can be sought if the military and other authorities think that these contracts are necessary, and also the fines given to Boeing seemed quite low. Last December though, a federal judge who had previously opined that Boeing was escaping very lightly rejected that plea agreement on technical grounds. And the news this March was that Boeing themselves are now pushing to withdraw the guilty plea agreement. The latest that we've heard in this story is that the judge has now set a date for a Boeing trial on the 23rd of June this year, and at this point it's not really clear what that means for Boeing. But the relatives of the victims of the 2 crashes have been asking for a Boeing trial for years, so it now looks like they could get their wish granted. So, what do you think? Have I missed any important stories in the last month? Let me know in the comments here below, or if you want me to expand more on any of these stories. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you are watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.